They say no royal favourite in English history ever died worse than Hugh Despenser the Younger, but that's the polite version. The real story ends in Hereford, England, autumn of 1326, with his genitals burning on a stick and a queen watching from her horse. History calls him greedy, corrupt, and power-hungry. What it doesn't say is how personal his punishment became. How despised does a man have to be for nobles to deny him a trial, strap him to a scaffold, and slice him open alive while the crowd cheer? Despenser didn't just abuse his power, he flaunted it as the king's most notorious favourite. Until suddenly, he wasn't. What you're about to hear isn't a scandal. It's a state-sponsored ritual killing, an autopsy of power, loyalty, and the kind of secrets that make queens sharpen knives. So let's begin, not with screams, but with inheritance. Because before he died screaming, he learned how to take whatever he wanted and who to ruin along the way. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger, and before he became a national hate figure dangling from the gallows in Hereford, he was just another ambitious noble with a famous name and a taste for property that didn't belong to him. Son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, a longtime court loyalist, the younger Despenser had pedigree. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more, and in medieval England, more always meant two things: land and the king's ear. So in 1306, he married Eleanor de Clare, granddaughter of King Edward I, tying himself directly to the royal bloodline. It wasn't love, it was calculation, and it worked. By 1318, Despenser had muscled his way into the king's inner circle and secured the post of royal chamberlain, a fancy way of saying he controlled who got access to Edward II and who didn't. Think about what that means. A man nobody elected now held the keys to every royal favour, every bribe, every secret whisper in the throne room. And he didn't waste the opportunity. They won't teach you this part in schools, but Despenser was running a shadow regime from the king's own pocket. He used forged documents, intimidation, even piracy to grab land from nobles across England and the Welsh marches. The Marcher lords, who ruled the wild frontier near Wales, had long acted as their own warlords. Despenser humiliated them. He seized castles, imprisoned rivals, and had their lands redistributed, mostly to himself. His appetite was legendary. Chronicler Adam Murimuth described him as a man insatiable in covetousness. Local records show that if Despenser wanted your estate, your inheritance, or even your title, he didn't sue. He arrived with forged writs and armed guards, and if you said no, you disappeared. In 1322, he helped the king crush a rebellion by the Earl of Lancaster, then personally oversaw Lancaster's execution and claimed his lands. He even looted Lancaster's treasuries for fun. This wasn't just greed, it was policy. With Despenser whispering in his ear, Edward II began a campaign of punishment across the nobility. Lords were arrested, stripped of property, exiled. The message was clear. Hugh Despenser speaks for the crown, but you and I know what that really means. Power like that doesn't grow in daylight, it grows in fear. And the Queen was watching. Isabella of France, Edward's own wife, saw her influence vanish under Despenser's rise. He froze her accounts, cut her off from allies, and even confiscated her dowry lands. Her own wedding gifts, gone. That's not just politics, that's a declaration of war. So while Despenser grew rich on land and royal indulgence, another plan was taking shape, cold, deliberate, and French. But here's the detail they buried. Isabella didn't just want to humiliate Hugh Despenser, she wanted to erase him. And soon, she'd have help. Because if you rob enough nobles, jail enough barons, and spit on enough traditions, the crown won't protect you. It will drown with you. Next came the letters, the warships, the secret deals in Paris, and Despenser never saw them coming. It started with silence. Queen Isabella, humiliated and sidelined, stopped speaking in court. Her voice had been replaced by Despenser's decrees, her alliances gutted by his land grabs, and her marriage reduced to cold ritual. But silence is never empty. In 1325, Edward II sent her on a diplomatic mission to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV. She wore the same royal seals Despenser had tried to take from her. She crossed the Channel alone, and she did not come back. Think about that. A Queen of England, effectively vanishing into foreign territory with her son and heir in tow. That's not diplomacy. That's a defection. And what she built from exile would become one of the most effective revenge plots in medieval history. Paris smelled like hearth smoke and perfumed ash, and in that ash, Isabella found Roger Mortimer, former Marcher Lord, exiled rebel, brilliant tactician. She had known him as a traitor. Now, she made him a partner. Most chroniclers claim it was political at first. Some imply it became something more. We don't need to speculate. What matters is what they did next. While Despenser fortified castles in England, Isabella and Mortimer fortified alliances in France and Hainault. The she-wolf of France, they called her. They didn't mean it as a compliment. But she made it prophecy. In September 1326, her fleet crossed the English Channel. Cold water, clattering armor, whispered prayers in Norman dialect. They didn't land as invaders. They landed as a reckoning. You weren't supposed to know this part, how easily England flipped. Barons who had once bowed to Despenser now opened their gates to Isabella. Towns rose in her name. Clergy denounced the king from pulpits. Even the army fractured. She had turned every enemy Despenser made into a weapon. Some say the invasion was bloodless. Not quite. In Bristol, Despenser's uncle was hanged from a church tower. In Oxford, royal officials were dragged into the streets and gutted. It wasn't a battle, it was a collapse. Picture it, royal guards abandoning their posts as villagers cheered. The throne had become a coffin, and Edward was still sitting in it. The king and his favourite fled west, desperate to find safety in the Welsh strongholds. But even there, the walls whispered. Loyalists evaporated, supplies vanished, farmers refused to feed them. They were ghosts long before they were caught. And that's the part they buried, how quickly the King of England became a fugitive. By October, Isabella controlled most of the country. Her banners flew from castle walls that once barred her entry. Royal writs now bore her seal. She wasn't just rebelling, she was ruling. And every mile her army advanced, Despenser's world shrank. He had made enemies out of nobles, commoners, even God's anointed. And now all of them were marching to see him fall. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? This was a public exorcism. And Hugh Despenser was the demon they came to drag screaming into daylight. They caught him in South Wales, soaked to the bone, hiding with a king who had run out of friends. Hugh Despenser the Younger, once the most powerful man in England after Edward II himself, was now a hunted traitor trembling in shackles. It was November 1326. The Queen's rebellion had swept across the kingdom like a righteous plague, and now it came to collect. Think about that. You spent years bleeding every rival dry, playing king behind the throne, and in the end, you're dragged through the wet November roads by the same nobles you tried to erase. Edward was imprisoned. But Despenser, they had something far worse in mind. First came the mockery, the clanking cart through Hereford's cobbled streets, lined with townsfolk hurling dung and bone. Then came the silence, the kind that drops when the spectacle becomes sacred. Despenser was given no defense, no trial in any real sense of the word. The court was summoned in haste, with Queen Isabella watching from a window above, veiled in black. This was theatre, and the script had already been written. He was accused of theft, heresy, tyranny, and sodomy. Some charges were true. Some were fabricated. All were damning. Guilty wasn't just inevitable. It was choreographed. You weren't supposed to see this part, but the records say she watched, eyes locked, as the verdict was read aloud like a wedding vow in reverse. Chroniclers like Geoffrey Le Baker and the Brute Chronicle described the scene in lurid detail, but even they can't agree whether the Queen blinked. The accusations had weight beyond legal guilt. Sodomy, in particular, was more than moral outrage. It was about humiliating the Despenser name, severing him from power not just physically, but sexually. The crowd wasn't just bloodthirsty. They were participating in a reversal ritual. Every privilege Despenser enjoyed as royal favorite would now be inverted, mocked, stripped, and annihilated in public. His tyranny would be returned to him piece by piece. Picture it. The Chamberlain, who once brokered foreign alliances, was now surrounded by guards debating whether to drag him by horse or by rope. The man who confiscated estates now begged for the mercy of a swift death. And above, the Queen didn't speak. That silence was louder than any scream, and here's the part they buried. The execution wasn't meant to end him quickly. It was designed to humiliate his legacy, invert his power, and turn his body into a symbol of everything the new regime would not tolerate. And what came next wouldn't just strip him of titles, it would rip him apart, literally. The crowd at Hereford had been promised a reckoning. What they got was theatre, soaked in blood. November 24th, 1326, a frostbitten morning on the Welsh border. Hugh Despenser the Younger, once the most powerful man in England, was stripped, shackled, and tied backwards to a mangy old horse. They dragged him through the filth-caked streets, his skin scraping against the stones, crowds flinging dung, fish heads, and scripture. A monk in the back clutched a Bible and muttered prayers. The rest. They jeered like it was market day. Somewhere above it all, behind a window with heavy drapes, Queen Isabella was said to be watching. Some chroniclers claim she turned away. Others insist she never blinked. We can't know for sure. But silence, in moments like this, is a statement. The scaffold waited in the square like a butcher's block, and Hugh was hoisted up by the neck, but not to die, just enough to black out. Then, they let him down. That's when the real message began. A hot iron was pulled from the coals, glowing white, and used to cauterize his groin. Then, while still conscious, they castrated him. No surgeon, no mercy. Just two men with knives and a crowd eager for the scream. You can still hear it in some versions of the tale, echoing off the cathedral walls. His genitals were burned in front of him, a ritual humiliation for the alleged sodomy with Edward II. And you need to understand this wasn't an afterthought. It was the centerpiece. Think about that. They didn't just want him dead. They wanted him rewritten. By the time they opened his abdomen, the priest had fainted. Intestines were dragged out, cauterized, and fed to the flames. One chronicler says the executioners paused halfway through to laugh. Another says they simply stared as the organs twitched. Neither version is comforting. Then came the decapitation. But even that couldn't go smoothly. It took 2 strokes. Mild inconvenience. Your neck is tougher than expected. The head was lifted, lips still quivering, and shown to the crowd. His body was quartered, each limb sent to a different city like hate mail from the Queen. One to York, one to Dover, one to Bristol, and one to London. A map of mutilation. And what of Isabella? She said nothing. Ever. Not a single recorded comment on that day, or on Hugh Despenser again. They called it justice. But it looked more like a message carved in human flesh. The scaffold at Hereford was swept clean. The crowds went home. The Queen said nothing. And the King, the man Hugh Despenser lived and died beside, wasted away in a stone cell, deposed, humiliated, and finally murdered under cover of night, with a red-hot poker slipped where no blade could be found. That's how this story ends. Not with a battle, not with a trial, but with bodies vanishing into ditches, with monarchs turning their faces from fire, and with secrets buried deeper than the bones. Hugh Despenser wasn't just punished. He was symbolically erased, masculinity annihilated, alliances torched, his very limbs scattered like a warning. But you're starting to see it now, aren't you? This wasn't just about corruption. It was about control. Who gets remembered? Who gets castrated? Who gets edited out of history like a bad sentence in a sacred text? They cleaned the blood from the stones, but they couldn't clean the silence that followed. And if they could do that to the king's favorite, right in front of a queen, what do you think they did to the ones history didn't even bother to name? If you want more forbidden history like this, the kind they tried to smother under clean schoolbook lies, then subscribe, because this was just one secret, and we're only getting started.